Welcome once again to another episode of There's Just Something About Kansas City. And I can't tell you how honored I am to have this guy on the other end of a Zoom call here. And I just want Jason Kander to know he's just our second Zoom that we've ever had. And the other one was none other than Kevin Harlan, okay, the voice of America, who joined us from up in the upper wilds of Wisconsin. But Jason, I appreciate you joining us today. I know you are on the cusp of your 43rd birthday, okay, coming up here. And I'm going to tell you something. Not many people have crammed more living into 43 years than you have. It's a phenomenal story that we'll explore today.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. As I said before we started recording, I grew up watching you, so this is fun for me. Plus, Kansas City's like one of my favorite subjects. So
yeah, right. And of course, it is our favorite subject. That's for sure. Let's talk a little bit about, let's start from the beginning. Let's go back to your childhood. You're born and raised in Kansas City in Overland Park, right? And your dad was a police officer and your mom was a probation officer. I think there was probably a little bit of discipline in that family.
There was, but it was also in a lot of ways. So they actually were, you have it right. But also they were both juvenile probation officers together. And then my dad was also a police officer. So he had a second job. But I've always described it exactly the way you said. So that's what's out there because it was just easier to explain it that way. What that meant really in the way we were raised was they had sort of seen that there were times when you really need a lot of discipline, but then there's a lot of times where kids just need to figure it out on their own. And so in a lot of ways, we had a lot of free reign. Like in my neighborhood, I was born in Overland Park, grew up in Shawnee. My whole family on my dad's side had always been from KC-Mo. Like my kids are sixth generation KC-Mo kids. And so I knew all along, like, I'm probably going to move to KC-Mo when I grew up. But my parents worked over there. And so grew up over there. And, you know, it's little things like, for instance, I remember I was allowed to cuss in the house and none of my friends were, you know, when I was younger. And so they just picked what they would be strict about. And I think they picked well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that you and your brother, Jeff, right, he's your younger brother, they also fostered some kids too, right? So you had some foster kids in the house while you grew up, correct?
Yeah, we refer to it as like unofficial foster because we don't know how else to explain it. But it was basically, there were like kids in our lives, mostly who were like friends of mine and my brothers, whose families were struggling in one way or another, that just came to live with us. And that I think was really the legacy of my parents being, juvenile probation officers.
Right.
And so it was, and there was never like a conversation. Well, we were thinking Justin might come to live here for a while, or Mel, or any of that. It was just, there was another spot at the dinner table, and then they were just part of the family. So it was a great way to grow up. Yeah.
Have you stayed in contact with the Fosters?
Oh yeah, they were the groomsmen at my wedding.
Wow.
We actually, with the exception of one of them, they all live in other places in the United States, but we try, the four of us, to get together. And, in the modern age, the way you stay in touch is we have a text thread that's very active. But like a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I guess, we were all in town at the same time, and we had a sleepover at one of the guys' houses.
Just like the old times, right?
Yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah, that's cool. And what about your brother, Jeff? He's
doing great. He and his wife are engineers. They got engineering degrees at UMKC. They have a couple of kids, and it's great. He's in town.
So he still lives here too then? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. And mom and dad?
They're doing pretty well, getting older, but they're doing well. They show up at most of my son's baseball games, and even, I'm still playing. I play men's league baseball. They're at a lot of those, and they're doing pretty well.
Yeah. I understand you're one of those orthopedist dreams still, right? You're playing senior men's baseball. They love you guys, right? It's like pickleball. It just took over for racquetball as far as the orthopedic guys are concerned,
Yeah, no, we're crazy. Like we refuse to. I mean, I ought to be playing softball if I'm playing anything, but I'm not. We play baseball. We play about 50 games a summer, and there's 2 leagues. I play in an over 30 and an over 40, and it's a good challenge for me because there's a fair amount of guys who used to get paid to do it out there, and so I work very hard to remain the number 9 hitter on a good team.
Oh wow, that's a pretty good deal. Yeah. Any names you want to drop as far as guys who still play that were former professional players?
Oh,
anyone we would recognize.
Yeah, probably not guys you'd recognize because we're not talking MLB, right? We're talking we're talking single A, some independent ball.
Didn't quite make it.
Yeah, but name as far as other names on the team you'd recognize, it'd be like BJ Kissel, who you would know, who he played at K-State and pitched in the College World Series. But the reason you'd know him is because he was the Chiefs insider, reporter, and is always on, I think, 810 all the time.
Yeah.
So
he's
still a very good pitcher.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And baseball was your love as you were growing up. I know you played in high school. I'm not sure if you went and played at American University or not, but you certainly played all at Bishop Miege High School growing up, right?
Yeah, and then in high school I did debate and I did baseball, and then strangely I chose a college that had neither, and so then my brother Mel and I actually started the debate team for a year at American, and did well, and then realized like, we're going to school in Washington, D.C. Why are we doing the same thing we did in high school? And so we stopped after our freshman year. Yeah, gosh, that's crazy. And how was how was that experience? And we'll talk about Diana here in a minute. She was your high school sweetheart at Miege. I'm assuming she was a high school sweetheart. She might have gone somewhere else. Blue Valley. Okay. And we met through debate. So I always joke that's the last argument I won, but it's also the only time there was a judge. So that's pretty good. And she's a superstar in her own right. She calls herself a innovation nerd, I think is how she describes herself. But she's a keynote speaker and she's just very, very influential in her own world as well. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. No, when I was 17 and I was dating Diana, who, for context, Diana's family came here in '89 when she was 8 years old as refugees from the Soviet Union. And, so around that time, like they were kind of starting to make their way, like they had a small business and stuff. But, I had grown up with a certain amount of privilege and Diana had not. And, my parents loved Diana. That was no problem. But at one point, my dad did ask me when he could tell, like, I was very into this girl. He was like, well, and he knew like I wanted to go into public service probably. And he was like, well, how are you all going to make money? And I was like, he reminded me of this recently. I had forgotten it. I was like, Dad, I think Diana's going to make a lot of money. And, at the time, I'm talking about the refugee girl who like he loved, but he was kind of thinking, I'm not sure about that. And not long ago, my dad reminded me of that. And he said, so you nailed that one. Like I was totally wrong. So she is a superstar, and I'm very fortunate that she does what she loves and is the primary breadwinner around here. Yeah, and well, you married well. Yeah, I mean, she's pretty great. And then talk about the kids. Of course, your son True, and then your daughter Bella, who we'll talk about a little bit. You named the operation for the refugee evacuation out of Afghanistan after her. We'll get into that in a minute. But how are the kids, and how's all that going? It's great. They're very fun. True is 10. Bella is 3. And so she's hilarious in all the right ways. She is a carbon copy of Diana. In that she is like the most outgoing 3-year-old you'll ever meet. Her name is Bella Brave Kander. So she'll walk up to people and say, what's your name? Just random people, of course. And they'll tell her, and she'll say, it's funny, she'll say, I'm Bella Brave Kander. This is my daddy, Kander Jason. And then she'll say, because she kind of has, it's part of her narrative back, sort of mixed up. She'll say, we're from the Army. So it's, she was like sick at daycare recently, and they called and they said, she wanted us to get her daddy, and she also wants us to know that she wants to be in the Army. I was like, okay. And then True is great. True's he'll turn 11 in September, and he is a much better baseball player than I was, which is fun. He is doing that Golden Glove highest level competitive thing, and it's interesting because he's kind of undersized. for that level. But he's very skilled. So it's sort of like, it's interesting to watch him figure that out. I mean, he does the super utility, play every position on the field thing. And so I'm now, the point being, I'm now a travel baseball type parent.
Right.
And it's very fun. It's a great team, a great bunch of parents too. And so we're really enjoying that.
Yeah. Besides 2 books we will talk about eventually, you also did a book with True called Courage Is. It's a children's book, right?
Yeah, we did. And it's fun. Whenever True has some big purchase that he wants to make, he will haul out one of the copies that the publisher sent us, and he'll kind of go door to door in the neighborhood and sell it at like a markup.
He's raising funds for himself, right? At that point?
Yeah.
Oh God, that's awesome. Yeah. Okay. And so you're at American University, and 9/11 happens. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I think I have the story. You joined the ROTC at American. Is that what you did at that point?
That's pretty close to what happened. So that's what would have happened if I'd had my druthers. So I was in my 3rd year, but I did 3 years. I finished college in 3 years because Diana finished in 2.5, and I was trying to keep up with her. But so it was my 3rd year of college, and 9/11 happened, and I was, I think right around that time, had gotten accepted to Georgetown Law School. And so I immediately decided, okay, I want to join the Army. And I looked into different ways to do it. And I found out, I could do ROTC while I'm in law school. Of course, a lot of people said to me, they're like, what are you, dumb? Why don't you just finish law school and go straight in as an Army lawyer? And at the time, I was like, 9/11 had just happened. And I was like, I'm going to have my whole life to be a lawyer if I want to be. I wanted to be a regular officer. I wanted to go in and not be a lawyer. And so instead of being able to go straight in, though, I actually had to rehab my knee, because right around that time, like a month after 9/11 or so, I tore my ACL playing pickup football. And so then I'm on crutches, and I got all these professors who were like Vietnam era being like, wait, I don't get it. Like, you're injured and you're like, to them, they're like, if there were a draft, you could get out of it. And so I spent like a year with surgery and rehab and all that. And then, started ROTC my first year of law school, and then did ROTC over that 3 years, and then got my commission as an Army intelligence officer.
Right. And you never wavered from that point. Like you said, you really wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you really wanted to get into the military at that point.
Yeah. I had, like we talked about, I'd grown up in this public service oriented family, and it wasn't like, hey, you should join the military, or hey, you should run for office. It wasn't like that at all. It was just, that was the example that I had seen. And so I was very interested in service, particularly in military service, and actually had considered, when I started college in 97, in 2000, I had considered the idea of ROTC, and ultimately didn't do it. And I remember I kind of put it sort of in a corner in my mind and said, maybe one day I'll join. And it was like in this maybe one day category. And I think had 9/11 not happened, there was like a 50% chance that I would have like finished law school and become like a reserve JAG in the Air Force or something like that. But instead, when 9/11 happened that day, I pulled it out of that maybe someday corner of my mind, and it just became, I'm going to do this, and then the rest of my life will happen around that instead of it being a piece of it. And so that's how I ended up becoming an Army intelligence officer. Right.
And then you served in Afghanistan at that point. Yep. And was that, you'd already graduated from law school, right? So then, like you said, then you went in, and we'll talk about how the politics came out of that, but you're in Afghanistan now. Now you're in a war zone, and you're a military and intelligence officer. And take us through that experience. And I know it heavily impacted your life.
Yeah. So my job over there was as the technical title that was given to the role. It was a new role. Was political military intelligence officer, which sounds kind of a lot softer, I think, than it is, which is to say that the other way it was referred to by my commander was the internal stability guy. And what that meant was trying to help maintain some sort of internal stability in the Afghan government. And the way to do that was by investigating corruption and espionage and narco trafficking that was part of the Afghan government and military. So the easiest way to say it is that it was my job to figure out which of the supposed good guys were actually bad guys pretending to be good guys.
Right.
And my boss over there, my colonel, actually later told me that he thought of it as thug int. And so int is this military abbreviation for intelligence, and you have all these different disciplines of int, right? So you have like SIGINT, which is signals intelligence, you're listening, right? Or IMINT, which is imagery intelligence, you're taking pictures. Thugint was a made-up term that he used to say that he said to me, it was your job to develop relationships with thugs so that we could get information on other thugs. And so that meant spending a fair amount of time outside the wire, usually just myself and my translator Salam or some other translators. Sometimes I did travel with like 2 or 3 other guys, maybe even up as many as 5 others at times. But for the most part, it was there was a lot of, for lack of a better term, freedom and sort of self-responsibility to go out and sort of run down leads and develop information and develop a lot of relationships.
Right, and you talk in your book about, on outside the wire on many different levels, but outside the wire is a scary place to be. If you are, because you're out now, you're amongst the thugs that you're trying to manipulate and trying to figure out who's who and what's what, and they're trying to figure you out and they're trying to figure out how to manipulate you. So it is really, it's like a spy versus spy almost out there.
Well, yeah, and it's my role was interesting because I was also the analyst for that intelligence, which is pretty rare that you get to do both. So I would go out and I would develop the intelligence and, send it up the chain. But also sometimes I was the one who analyzed it and wrote it up and sort of made assessments, which was a lot for, the funny thing about it was I was a second lieutenant, which anybody who's ever been in the military listening to this is like laughing right now at the idea that I had this amount of responsibility as a second lieutenant. And it was just sort of this perfect storm. And that meaning I was a very junior officer and I was doing a job that was actually sort of set up for a lieutenant colonel, which basically means I was doing a job meant to be done by somebody who had been in the military for 17 to 20 to 25 years. This was my first job in the military, and it happened because they needed somebody to do this job. They weren't really collecting and analyzing this intelligence, and they needed to know more about the extracurricular activities of these people that the commander, the ambassador, local battalion commanders, all these people were dealing with, and they needed to know, like, what are these people doing when we're not with them? Like, right. What are the dangers here? And I was, for a few months in a row, the only Army intelligence officer who showed up to the unit, like the only one they were going to get. And so my commander, Colonel McCracken, he said at one point he was trying to figure out like a justification for putting me in this job. And he goes, well, you have a law degree. That's something. And it was really funny because, I mean, the law degree was useless. I had nothing to do with the job, so it was kind of a perfect storm. And I really, strangely, I really enjoyed the work because at first you are quite frightened. And then, it becomes a job. And particularly everybody around you is doing this kind of stuff. They're all in Afghanistan. And the Army teaches you that everybody else has it worse. They teach all of us that. That's how they get you to go do the hard jobs. And I didn't really understand that I was undergoing any kind of trauma.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Because it was just your day-to-day job and you just figured, well, somebody's got it worse than I do. And I know this is tough on me, but there's somebody else out there and they need my help. And I was going to say, when when your superior comes, it probably doesn't have a whole lot of lawyers out there, especially in a war zone like Afghanistan. So he figured he could probably lean on you, knowing you're, probably a pretty sharp guy, and that this is a pretty tough job.
Yeah, it was. I appreciated the faith, and the other thing was, look, I was 25 years old, and there's a reason that we send young people to do this kind of stuff. I mean, I was pretty sure I was bulletproof.
Yeah.
And I also, I mean, it was exciting, you know, I mean, it's the most exciting thing I've ever done for sure. And, you know, there were moments where, you know, you're going into some meeting and you're with, you know, you're wearing street clothes and you're with another guy wearing street clothes who's much more experienced than you. And he turns to you and he says, okay, in this room, by the way, I go by this name. and you just have moments where you're like, this is a movie. Like, I can't believe I get to do this. So I loved it.
Right. Okay. So when you honorably discharged, obviously after your time was up, how much time? I sort of get this confused when I read all the stuff about you because there's so much here. How much time was it before you decided that, you know, your translator had gotten out when we got out of Afghanistan, okay? And your translator had gotten out, but his relatives, his family had not gotten out. How long after you had been discharged did you find that out and then you start to put together the idea for Operation Bella?
Quite a long time. So my translator, Salam, it's actually very interesting. Salam was very unique, and this was very fortunate for him and for me because it made me not have to worry about him so much. Salam, because his father was a diplomat, was actually in the United States when he was born. So he was born in the United States. So he was actually an American citizen.
Right.
Now, when as an infant, they went back to Afghanistan. So he grew up in Afghanistan. And then after high school, because he was the only one in the family that was an American citizen, you know, his family was like, you should go back. And so he came to the United States and he had a whole career here. And he brought his sisters over and everything. But, you know, he had worked in all sorts of jobs. He had been a flight attendant. When I got over there, he was working as a contractor as a translator, and because he was an American citizen, he was able to get the highest level clearance, which is how he ended up being the translator for the intelligence division.
Right.
And he and I, you know, we spent a ton of time together. And in addition to that, Salam, actually the last place in the United States he had lived was Kansas City. So it was just a crazy coincidence that the two of us were paired up. And, you know, now Salam lives in Puerto Vallarta. I asked him why, and he said, well, why not? Which was fair. And Salam, he's 75 years old now. And what happened was, so I got out in 2011. Salam came back to the U.S. not long after that and lived here. And then 2021, when the U.S. was pulling out of Afghanistan, well, I should add one more piece of context, which is when we were over there together, I knew that he had a bunch of family there. I think I may have briefly met them, but I don't really remember. But I was eating their food all the time because Salam would go to visit them and he would bring all these amazing leftovers. And so I would sit around. So I knew a little bit about them. So now 10 years goes by. It's 2020, 10 years since I got out of the Army goes by. It's 2021. And there's, you know, the withdrawal is happening. And everybody who has people over there is trying to get them into the airport, as you may recall, in Kabul.
Right.
And it's a real mess. And the Taliban is taking over. And it's very upsetting anyway. But I remember thinking how relieved I was that Salam had been an American citizen. I didn't have to worry about Salam. And it was a difficult time for all of us who had served. So, you know, I was checking in on a bunch of my battle buddies from over there. And Salam and I are close and we've stayed in touch. And Salam told me, he called me and told me that his nephew, Rahim, and the entire family, including Salam's cousin Shakiba, who is Rahim's mother, there were 12 of them in Kabul, and they were in a lot of danger because Rahim and his brother Farhad had both worked for the coalition at some point. But what's interesting is Rahim's story is really remarkable. Rahim had actually become a banker in Kabul, and he was the head of payroll for the Afghan International Bank. And his clients were the payroll clients were all the multilaterals. They were the U.S. Embassy, the United Nations, all these coalition organizations that were hiring all these Afghans. So he literally had, and he was one of like 3 people who had access to this entire list of people, which meant the Taliban figured out that Rahim had access to a list of like 100,000 Afghans who had collaborated, as the Taliban would put it, with the coalition. people who, the Taliban considered to be infidels and traitors. Right. And they wanted this list, and they started harassing Rahim. They tried to kidnap him. They shot at him as he got away. They got a hold of his brother Najim and beat Najim to try and get Rahim to give up his location. He received multiple letters that were death threats. And in fact, in one case, one of the letters notified him that he and his family had been sentenced to death for their failure to cooperate. And so now he was on the run from the Taliban, and 12 people was just too many people to get into the airport. And Rahim had been clear with me that everybody was in danger. And so he couldn't leave any of them behind. And so that's what we were presented with in August of 2021. Right.
And so you put together Operation Bella, and it was basically you're trying to get that family out, right? I think and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but okay, we want to get this family out. Okay. Yeah. And you're not knowing exactly how many people that will entail. And then you go into Operation Bella. How'd you put together Operation Bella?
It just snowballed, man. I mean, you're right. At first, I just wanted to get the Raufi family out. Rahim, the Salam, Rahim, the Raufis. I was trying to get the Raufi family out, and I didn't have any idea how to do it. And at first, we tried, through the airport. That didn't work. Then all the U.S. planes left, and then it looked pretty grim. Obviously, I mean, the Taliban now had total control. There was nobody other than the Taliban in the country at that point, and it really seemed like they were going to find the people they needed to find. At that point, I started trying to just scramble and put together anything I could. I started bringing in others, some people I knew from politics, some people I knew from the military, and started trying to raise money to do this, not really knowing what we were going to do. And then I met some people who also had folks over there who they were trying to get out, and they had a relationship with what had been the national airline of Afghanistan, Kander, and they came up with this idea of trying to fly people out through Mazar-e Sharif, which is way up north in Afghanistan. And at that point, because I had done a GoFundMe to try to raise money to do this, it had a lot of other vets had come out of the woodwork with families that they were trying to get out. And so all of a sudden, instead of it being 12 people I was trying to get out, I was one of two guys who was sort of the default leaders of this group that had 75 families. And we ended up, we got them to, look, we didn't go there. They did everything. They took all the risk on. So they all had to make their way up to Mazar-e Sharif, past these, Taliban checkpoints. They had to have a cover story. It took a lot of courage. And then they had to hide in Mazar-e Sharif while we tried to put together a way to get a plane in there and get them out and come up with some sort of way to fool the Taliban. Because the way the game worked at that point was, if the Taliban was looking for you and they found you, they could do whatever they wanted. They ran the country. They were more than likely going to shoot you in the head, or at best, put you in prison. But the Taliban did seek to have some sort of international presence. They wanted to be a little more like Iran, like a pariah state, but not to the point where they had no ability to deal with the outside world. And that meant that the going theory was that they would honor visas if people got to the airport. So basically it was like capture the flag. If you were on a flight manifest that was fully visa cleared in another country, that meant that they could do whatever they wanted to do still. But if they didn't find you until you presented inside the airport and you were on that list, now it'd be an international incident if they shoot you because you're expected in another country.
Right.
And now there's no planes flying in Afghanistan at that point. There were a bunch of planes stuck on the runway in Mazar-e Sharif, and they had manifests, but they weren't taking off because they didn't have anywhere to land. And slowly they started to be able to take off to fly to Qatar, to the U.S. Air Base, and that's what we were hoping to do. It turned out that a lot of pressure got put on the administration because there were still some Americans left in the country. So there was a lot of pressure politically not to let any more Afghans out. And so all of a sudden that got cut off. And so at that point, we had actually staged everybody. We had to stage them in one place to do this movement. And so the cover we came up with was a wedding. So they were faking a wedding in Mazar-e Sharif, thinking it would be for a few hours. And then we'd put them on buses, move them into the airport. but then we couldn't get the landing rights. So we had to scramble. So not only did we have to fool the Taliban, but we ended up having to work around the U.S. government. And we did some shuttle diplomacy with the nation of Albania. And basically, it turned out tourist season was ending in Albania. And they were open to the idea of somebody paying to fill up an entire oceanside resort. So that's what happened is we ended up, after a few days of all these people hiding in a wedding hall in Mazar-e Sharif, we were able to move them to the airport and fly them out to Albania, where they lived for almost 2 years waiting on the U.S. to grant their visas to come to the United States.
That's incredible. And the total number of people, 383, correct?
383 in Operation Bella. And then we realized we kind of knew how to do this. So a few of us hung around and started a nonprofit called Afghan Rescue Project, which now not only has ended up getting out over 2,100 people, but it was sort of asked to participate in other international crises. And so now I'm just a board member, and it has been renamed the American Rescue Project because it's been very involved in Ukraine as well, doing refugee stuff, first aid training for first responders, all sorts of different stuff.
Yeah, it's like a never-ending situation in the world that we face.
It's crazy.
Here.
It was pure accident. I mean, I just was fumbling around trying to figure out how to get the Roofi family out. The Roofi family now lives 6 minutes from our house here in Kansas City. They chose to move to Kansas City because they said that's where their family lives. And when they meant family, they meant the Kander family. So
right.
They are part of our family. And, we all have a big dinner usually every week or so. And it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, some great Afghan food. And I'm sure they like barbecue.
Yeah, they are, they don't eat pork. So we have to do all the other types of barbecue.
That's
right. But yeah, they do like it. I introduced them to, there's always barbecue sauce at their house now, so it's a really special thing, especially, one, the full circle nature of the resettlement agency that resettled Diana's family here, Jewish Vocational Services, is the one that has resettled the Raufis here. And, Diana likes to joke, Jason does the rescuing, I do the resettling, because she knew how to do that. And she's been super involved. She's gotten, and the Kansas City community's been incredible. Like so many of our friends and people who we didn't even know before have come out of the woodwork to be there for the Roofi family and help them with literally everything. And now they're doing great. The kids are in school and they're flourishing, and Raheem and his brothers all work at Commerce Bank because a good buddy of mine named Lee Urban got them interviews, and then they're just amazing guys. So they got the jobs.
They were bankers anyway, right?
Yeah. Raheem actually does a very similar job to the one he did in Afghanistan. Wow. And then his brothers are security guards there. So it's very cool.
And you have to be very proud of that. I know you're not that kind of guy, okay? But I'm just saying you have to be so proud that Operation Bella has flourished into what it has been. And it's almost like the military saying, leave no man left behind. Okay. And I think that's part of it.
I'm very proud. It's the biggest, craziest, most important thing I've ever done. And I also, though, am very conscious of the fact that we got very lucky several times, because there were a lot of moments where it could have not just gone bad for the Roofi family, but we had 383 people in one place, and they were all wanted by the Taliban, and they ended up, there for 3 nights sleeping in this wedding. So there were many, many moments where it could have been the worst thing I ever did, and so I think about that a lot. How a razor thin edge, it could have gone completely the other direction, and I'm very grateful for how it went.
Yeah, even to the fact as the airplane's taking off, the whole place went dark. And the airplane's taking off in the dark. Okay, no lights on the plane, no lights on the runway, no lights anywhere. And then you're taking gunfire into that airplane.
Yeah, it was, I still can't. I still sometimes I'm sitting around at the Roofis, we're all sitting on the floor eating or whatever, and I look around and I think, I just can't believe it. And it's such a special thing because they're a special group of people anyway, but I think often about, the guy who sponsored my wife's family in the first place and what he must have, I think he's passed away now, but what he must have felt, watching my wife and her younger sister, who's a doctor now, flourish. And I look around at these kids and I know that I'm just, one day I'll just be an old man in their lives. But I tell Raheem all the time that I can't wait until, they're like ready to graduate high school and they're coming to their dad and being just regular, entitled American kids sometimes, and just being like, hey, Lucy has an Apple Watch. Like I would like it, and I told them like, that's going to be so wonderful for me to watch. So.
Yeah. Yes. It's just, what a legacy too. And you've also created a legacy on the other side too. As we're talking about this, we go all the way from 11 to 21. Okay. While this is all happening and before it even starts happening, you are now in politics. Okay. And you're, one time you were thinking about running for president of the United States and you were Missouri Secretary of State and you were on the campaign trail and you were basically going to be the mayor of Kansas City. And I know through all this that you came out with another book called The Invisible Storm, and you started very openly, which is, we all know for men is an extremely difficult thing to do. Very openly, you start talking about PTSD, depression, and suicide. And I think that is one of the other legacies that you are bringing forward, Jason. I think it's incredible. And when did that all start to manifest itself inside of you?
Yeah. It much earlier than I realized it was happening. So when I came home from Afghanistan in 2007 and then eventually got out of the Army National Guard in 2011. But, when I first came home, looking back, I had some symptoms. I had this twitch in my eyelid for 6 months that didn't go away, and I was starting to have some nightmares and stuff like that. But to me at the time, I was like, I just got back. I'm sure it's fine. And then gradually over time, I always had this story I could tell myself as to either why it was getting better when it wasn't. And even in my first book, I said that story out loud, the one I'd been telling myself about how it was getting better. Specifically in my first book, I said that I still get nightmares, but they're no longer set in Afghanistan, because I genuinely thought that meant whatever it was, it's not related to my service. It wasn't until years later when I was in therapy that I learned actually that's a super dangerous thing. That the fact that now my nightmares usually consisted of some version of either myself or one of my loved ones being kidnapped or taken by bad guys. And for the first few years when I came home, it was just always set in Afghanistan. It was just me. And I understood that's related to my service because of the work I did, usually the greatest threat to my safety was the threat of being taken, because I was sort of out there more or less, alone with just a couple other people a lot of the time. And so I understood that. But then over time, it was like they evolved into being, I was just, at my house or out on the campaign trail or something like that. And so, I convinced myself that, well, it's not related to my service. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that I was downplaying to myself the nature of my service. I mean, you got to remember, I never fired my weapon during my deployment. I never had a bullet whiz by my ear. My vehicle was never blown up. And in my mind, that meant I was not a combat veteran. And it took, a clinical social worker at the VA, after I had announced that I was stepping back from everything, to sit down with me and sort of say it back to me and say, well, let me get this straight. You were in the most dangerous place on the planet, and you were, your job was to go out pretty much alone for hours at a time, totally vulnerable, with nobody knowing where you were, so nobody coming to get you if things went badly. And I was like, yeah. And they're like, that's combat. And so it took that many years for me to sort of come to terms with that. And so eventually that's what allowed me to go get help.
Right. And I'm sure, did you compartmentalize a lot of it? Just thinking about it, and like you said, you're making excuses, of course. Well, it's not that, or it's not this, and it's not as bad, and it's going to go away type thing. Did you, because you were so busy as well? I mean, you're campaigning, you're running for this, you're running for that, and the whole thing. It just seems like you were keeping yourself busy to sort of push all this into the background.
Yeah, the term that I was introduced to after I wrote the book, actually, which I wish I'd had it before, is overfunctioning, and that's what I was doing. It was that was my substance. People turned to all sorts of different things in order to self-medicate, right? Some people turn to alcohol, some people turn to drugs, some people, there's all sorts of things that people do to self-medicate. In my case, I happen to be very fortunate. I don't know if it's fortunate. I happen to have this, it was fortunate, I guess. I had this political career that was hard charging, that allowed me that was my medicine, right? And so the harder I worked, the more I kept myself busy, kept myself consumed with that kind of stuff, the more I could avoid myself. The symptoms I was having were hypervigilance, which is to say my brain never really accepted the idea that I was no longer in danger. So I couldn't really sit with my back to a door in a restaurant, or, when I was Secretary of State, my staff, they didn't know me before Afghanistan. So they just understood, well, the boss doesn't like it when someone sits behind him in a meeting. So we just don't do that, And so it was all these different things combined with these really terrible night terrors every night for about 11 years. I just overfunctioned. And I always say it that way because sometimes people will come up to me and they'll tell me about their own journey, and it may involve substance or alcohol, and they seem embarrassed about that. And I always say, look, I happen to have this other thing in my life. Had it not been for that thing, I would have gone that direction. So I stand in no judgment of anyone. Right.
Well, you were abusing something else. Yeah, right. You were abusing yourself in that situation, but not with drugs or alcohol. So
I also, the other thing about it, and I think this is important too, is that there's this thing in life, in American life. It's sort of part of the American mythos. It's a redemption myth. And if you think about like the movies, particularly the action movies and the most popular movies that like somebody my age, I'm about to turn 43, like you said, grew up on in the 80s and 90s, it's Top Gun. It's these sort of things where it's always sort of the same pattern. It's somebody goes through something really horrific, and then they recover thanks to a singular act of redemptive heroism, right? Top Gun's my favorite example, right? Because Goose dies, and literally you go straight to Act 3, where Maverick kills 3 bad guys over the Indian Ocean, and then he's good. He's good to go. He gets the girl. He moves on with his life. That's not the way it works, but that's the way I thought it worked. And so, in my mind, I think if I could save America, if I could, and then running from there, if I could save Kansas City from violent crime, then that would fill me up. That would fill the hole inside me. Right. But that was a mirage. It wasn't real.
Yeah. Okay. So you're running for mayor of Kansas City. Looks like you're going to win. Okay. And all of a sudden you drop out. Yeah. And was there a day? Was there a moment? Was there a conversation that you remember that it just said, I'm done. I've got to go take care of this?
Yeah. So I was getting progressively worse. What it was is I had been getting worse, but now I was getting worse faster, and it really scared me. And so my suicidal thoughts were becoming more frequent. And so I called the Veterans Crisis Line. And when I called, I did it very sheepishly. I in my mind, I still believed, well, this stuff is either not related to my service or my service is not legitimate enough for this. I genuinely thought that the lady on the other end of the line was going to say like, hey, keep this channel clear. we have people who really need help. And one of the first questions she asked me was, have you had suicidal thoughts? Have you had thoughts of suicide? And up until that point, the only person I had said anything about that out loud to was Diana. And so then I said yes. And as I said yes, I felt myself just completely lose it emotionally. And then what happened was the way she spoke to me on the other end of the line, I could tell by her tone of voice, immediately it struck me that I didn't sound any different to her than anybody else she had talked to in this job. And then it occurred to me that that's because I wasn't. And that was the first time I ever accepted the idea that this was post-traumatic stress. And I remember, then we made a plan for me to go into the VA the next day. And I remember I went into the other room, and I had many times in my life up to that point, I had Googled post-traumatic stress, but I had always done it as a way to read it and sort of find some loophole to convince myself that that's not what was going on. And this time I Googled it and I read it with my wife. And reading it with that frame of reference and with that open mind, it was like someone had written a description of me. And I turned to my wife and I said, it's been all these years and I had no idea that I got hurt over there. And that's when, I think a day or so later, I said, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah. And that comes to that realization. But also, like I said, being a man and being a veteran and where you were outside the wire and all the things you did and everything else that was going to happen, it's very, very difficult. I think you've probably talked about this, not just for men, but probably veterans too, who think, I was in a war zone and I'm macho and I'm this guy and I'm not bulletproof, but I'm this guy and it's not happening to me. That's got to be very, very difficult. And for you to come out and to be in the position you were in and to talk to people about this and to get them to seek help, I think is extremely important.
I appreciate that, Frank. It's interesting. I think that the most important thing I said when I made my announcement, just based on the feedback I get, particularly from vets, but also from non-vets, is when I said that the reason I had never gone to get help is because I felt I didn't earn it. And I think that's important because I think all those things you mentioned are an aspect of it, particularly for military folks. But I also think that the military has actually, not the military, but the veterans community has done a pretty good job of getting it across to vets now that it's not a sign of weakness to get help, that it can be an act of strength. It can be a wise choice and it's okay. The problem is that there's at least for the Army, and I'm sure for the Marine Corps and possibly for the Navy and the Air Force too, there is a real strong line of cultural teaching that goes through all of it from basic training on that says, what you're doing is no big deal. Somebody has it worse. And I don't fault the military for that because that's the reason I was able to keep going into meetings with people who might want to cut my head off, because I genuinely believed, well, somebody has it worse. It's not that big of a deal. And we need soldiers to be able to do hard things, and they have to believe that. The problem is there's no flipping off of that switch when you leave the service or when you finish a deployment. And so that was my problem, is I genuinely just believed if I go and say I have PTSD, that's stolen valor, because what I did is not enough to earn it. And I have found that ever since I said that out loud, that is a huge factor for a lot of people. And so at the time I had no idea whether what I was doing would help. And I certainly thought that I was basically canceling myself by doing it, because I'm kind of patient zero for politicians talking about their mental health this way. And really the only example we'd ever had was Eagleton, who had not talked about it voluntarily, but who's, was swept off the ticket. Here's a Missouri vet, young, hard charging guy. So I didn't think that the cards were very good for me if I did this, but it turned out that it was something people needed. And I wish that everybody who chose to go and get help like I did had the incredible experience of the positive feedback I've had of having people literally come up to you and say, like, your announcement or your book saved my life or saved my friend's life. I wish that for everybody, but I also remind everybody, whether you're a veteran or not, that if you are public about it, even just in your group of friends or among your coworkers, you might give somebody the permission slip they need to go save their own life. And so it's worth doing. Yeah, right. And you do have a platform. You are Jason Kander, and you are very well known, through politics or whatever. And that is, I think that's important as well, because they see somebody in public life do it. Then I think a lot of people turn around and say, you know what? If that guy can go out in front and talk about it, I can do it. Or if that guy can go seek help, so can I. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, I think a lot of people in my announcement felt seen. Like when I talked about, look, my deployment was only 4 months, and I never had to fire my weapon, but I have PTSD. I think it, at least, particularly for vets, I think it gave a permission slip to a lot of people, which is something I'm proud of. Yeah, right. And you also, I saw a quote, you say you have an irrational sense of self-confidence too. And I think that shows through, because I think once you did it, I think you felt like, you know what, with help, I can get through this. I hoped. That was one area where it was sort of an interesting, looking back, it's interesting. I was gifted by my parents, the way they raised me, this irrational self-confidence, but what PTSD had done is it had wrecked my self-esteem. So it was sort of like my self-confidence and my self-esteem were passing each other, one going up and one going down. I was very confident in my abilities as a professional and to do all these things, but I didn't think very highly of myself as a human at that point, because sometimes shame is something that accompanies trauma, and it did for me. And so that was the one area that I just kind of ran out of options. And now being public about it was I'd say 50% because I wanted to help somebody else in my shoes. But the other 50% honestly was I was a public person, and, I discussed with others in my life what else I could say other than this. And I could step back from everything and say it was something else. But I decided I didn't want to do that because I didn't know if I could get better, but I really felt strongly that I couldn't get better while pretending.
Right.
And so for me, it was important to not have to carry the burden that I'd been carrying for years of pretending everything was okay.
Right. And besides this and everything you're doing with that, it's you're still very, very involved with the veterans community, okay, with the tiny house projects, the Veterans Community Project, and all those things to try to get them out of homelessness, try to help them if they have PTSD or they have depression or whatever. So you continue to help.
Yeah, that's my day job. I'm the president of National Expansion for Veterans Community Project, which probably a lot of people listening to this are familiar because it started in Kansas City. It was a group of combat veterans predating me who came together and said, we can do something about this in our town. And they created the Village of Tiny Houses for Homeless Vets that is at 89th and Troost. And they were so successful that communities around the country were reaching out saying, hey, can you do it here? Which they had never aspired to or imagined doing when they started. They were just hoping to make it work here. And that was right around the time that I came around, because 6 weeks before I dropped out of the mayoral race, I actually toured Veterans Community Project. And it was really my one good day on the campaign as far as personally. And because I was just so turned on by it. And then 6 weeks go by, I end up trying to go to the VA and finding out that it was going to take some time to get me enrolled, and I really needed therapy then. So I called over there and they were like, well, just come down. So like thousands of other vets in Kansas City, I went through the front doors of the outreach center and they helped me. And a week later, I had my first therapy appointment at the VA. So I was a believer and I started just hanging around a lot. And this was when they were getting all these invitations. And I had, all but actually announced a run for national office. So I had a national network. And I had been kind of giving them advice on how they might go about expanding. And finally, they were like, hey, you're here a lot. Why don't you just come on full time? And this was, I was really doing well in therapy at that point and starting to think about what I might want to do next. And so that's what I did. So it's been 5 years now. I've been the president of National Expansion. And now there are villages in St. Louis and Sioux Falls and Boulder County, Colorado. And next up is Milwaukee and Phoenix. And then, moving on from there. Yeah,
and I think the other quote that I always see from you is, here is better. Here is a word, period. Is a word, is period. Better. Here is a period after that word as well, meaning, suicide is not the answer. It's not your only out in this kind of situation.
Yeah, and, I'm a big evangelist for post-traumatic growth being a real thing. The only... really, if you think about the depictions of PTSD, both, on the big screen, like in narrative fiction form, and in media, like in the news, it's generally untreated PTSD. That's usually what we see. We see people who are in the throes of it. It is usually like a combat veteran who is robbing a bank after they shot up heroin or something, or whatever. Or probably not heroin, probably coke. I don't really know how heroin or coke work, but you know what I mean? So, and I refer to that stuff as PTSD porn because it's just voyeurism. But post-traumatic growth is real. And it turns out that the vast majority of people who commit to a program and really, really do the therapy and do the work do get better, and they achieve post-traumatic growth. And so that term, here is better, is taken from, there was a documentary made about this, of which there were 4 subjects, 4 veterans they followed. I was one of them. And at a point in the film, I had said, here is better. And it was neat that they made it the title of the documentary. Yeah,
this has been an incredible visit for me with you. First with the Operation Bella, saving all those people, and then just continuing to do, I'll say God's work, okay, from that point on, and just, to continue to do this. I was going to ask you, because I know you're the president of the
VCP?
Yeah, the VCP. I was going to say, well, what's your next big thing? But I think you've already landed on your next big thing. And I'm not sure if this is it for you, if there's no more politics involved for you. But if this is your next big thing and your only big thing, it is just incredible for people to be able to reach out and find a person like you to try to help them get through whatever they're going through. Yeah,
I appreciate that. It's funny. I used to think prior to getting help, I thought all the time about what am I doing next? What am I doing next? Because it was, like any young, hard charging politician, that's part of it. But also I think there was an element of, I definitely had a guy in a hurry thing going on, because it's like, part of PTS, particularly from the work I did over there, was like, don't stay in one place too long. And so I thought all the time about my career. It sort of soothed me. Right. And now I don't really even think of myself as having a career. I'm enjoying my life, and I do things that I find meaningful or fun or important, or just I do things for people I care about. And I have the luxury of that. And so I remain involved in politics. It's not the way I earn a living, although I do have, I'll plug my podcast. I have a political podcast called Majority 54 that I co-host with my friend Ravi Gupta that still does very well. So we're very fortunate that, every week, like close to a couple 100,000 people listen to us say what we think about stuff. And that's a real privilege. And then, I do some activism. I will speak up here and there. And I have some friends who run for things like U.S. Senate or stuff like that. And I was a surrogate for Joe Biden in the last campaign. So I do that stuff. It's just not how I earn a living anymore. And it's not really how I recognize that to the extent that anybody still thinks of me in the zeitgeist out there, that I am seen, that I exist in that zeitgeist as a politician. I'm aware of that, but I don't feel like one. I feel like a assistant little league coach who is a nonprofit executive and an amateur baseball player.
Yeah,
that's my life at this point, and I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, it's like the old saying, if you love it, it's not work. So that right. That's a big thing. Okay, before we let you go, just your thoughts on Kansas City. Just the city. It's your hometown. It still is your hometown. All these other people have now joined you in your hometown. I think everybody can sort of sense how you feel about your hometown.
I love this place so much, and it's hard to really, I guess it's hard to put it into words other than to just say, like, I am very proud of the fact that my kids are 6th generation Kansas Cityans. This place is not just home for me. I mean, it is, when you are 5th generation in a place west of the Mississippi and you're Jewish, it means that like your family is so large in this place, right? Like, Diana's Jewish, and I always joke that I had to marry an immigrant to make sure that I was marrying a Kansas City Jew who I was not related to, because it's we've been here a while, and
you're not sure. So, let me check the family tree first.
Right, and I mean, and it is, Frank, I am not exaggerating when I tell you that Diana was the first Jewish friend I had who I was not related to. When I went to the East Coast for school, and all of a sudden, like, there's all these Jewish kids who grew up, like in New Jersey and New York, and it's like culturally much more Jewish. And here I grew up in Shawnee, and I come out to DC in my pickup truck, right? I mean, like, Kansas City, the roots that I have and that my family here and my family have here are so deep. And what has been really exciting for me, and I think for all of us over the past year to maybe 3 years, has been the way Kansas City has started to get its flowers internationally. Mm-hmm. And I don't just mean like the Chiefs are good and Taylor Swift keeps hanging out here, although I think that has helped people see us. I think people are really seeing that there is something special about Kansas City. And I just think that is so fun to see. But it also reminds me, and I hesitate to say this because I'll sound like a politician, or I'll sound like somebody who's running for mayor, but I think it's important to say. It also reminds me of how much work there is to be done here. I mean, there is such a violent crime issue. We are still a very segregated city. And when I was running for mayor, for the 5 minutes I was running for mayor, what I was frequently talking about and what I meant deeply was that we have something so special. We have so much prosperity happening here, but what is not yet happening at an adequate level is spreading that prosperity across the entire city and across the entire metro. And it is something that one day, if I do ever run for office again, I mean, maybe I would run for president, but I would maybe run for mayor one day, because I do love this place, and there is something, no matter where you're from, there is something really special about having the opportunity to make the place that brought you up a little bit better, and so I love being here.
Well, that's well said, and we're certainly proud of you. And we'll tell you to keep going. What you're doing has been just incredible. And I know there's a lot of people out there that they owe their lives to you. And I know you won't, pat yourself on the back that way, but they owe their lives to you for everything that you've done and everything that you've said and how honest you've been about your life. So we're proud to have you. And you're one of the reasons there's just something about Kansas City, Jason.
Well, Frank, thank you for having me. Thanks for helping get the word out about KC. It's really fun, and I'm glad to get the chance to be a part of it.